I finished my morning patrol loop around the eastern trails, marking off each checkpoint on my clipboard with mechanical precision. The weather had been perfect for 3 straight days, clear skies, comfortable temperatures, no chance of rain. But the trails remained empty. Walking back toward the visitor center, I counted the signatures in the logbook again. 3 people, 3 visitors in an entire week at a 50,000-acre national park in Montana. The numbers didn't make sense. August was supposed to be peak season, yet Blackwood felt like a ghost town. I'd worked here for 2 years, and while we'd never been Yellowstone-level busy, this level of emptiness felt different. Wrong somehow. Back at the ranger station, I pulled up the park's visitor statistics on my computer. Last August, we'd logged over 200 visitors for the same week. The year before that, nearly 300. I scrolled through the monthly reports, watching the numbers decline steadily over the past 18 months. Our online reviews were decent, nothing that would explain this dramatic drop in tourism. I leaned back in my chair and stared out the window at the parking lot. 5 empty spaces, painted lines bright yellow against weathered asphalt. My truck sat alone under the afternoon heat. The phone rang twice during my shift. Both calls were from people asking about driving directions to other parks, Glacier mostly. Nobody wanted to come here. When I asked if they had any interest in Blackwood, they gave vague excuses about time constraints or changed plans. One woman actually laughed and said she'd heard the place was too quiet. Too quiet. I'd never thought of that as a bad thing before. At 5 o'clock, I locked up the visitor center and loaded my camping gear into the truck. For the past month, we'd been getting reports about missing equipment from the Mirror Lake camping area. Tents, sleeping bags, cooking gear, all vanishing without a trace. The campers who reported the thefts seemed genuinely confused, insisting they'd secured everything properly before going to sleep. I'd investigated twice during daylight hours but found nothing useful. Tonight, I planned to camp there myself and see what happened after dark. The drive to Mirror Lake took 40 minutes on winding dirt roads that cut through dense pine forest. I'd made this trip countless times, but today the trees seemed to lean inward, creating darker shadows than usual. The road felt narrower, though I knew that was impossible. Mirror Lake lived up to its name. A perfectly still surface that reflected the surrounding peaks with crystal clarity. I chose a campsite on the northeastern shore, close enough to the main camping area to observe but far enough away to avoid spooking any potential thieves. The spot gave me clear sight lines in 3 directions. Setting up my tent, I moved efficiently through routines I'd performed hundreds of times. Tent stakes driven deep into the rocky soil, sleeping bag rolled out and positioned for quick access to my boots. Camp stove assembled and tested. Everything organized and ready. The lake remained perfectly calm as evening approached. No wind disturbed the surface. No ripples broke the reflection of the darkening sky. I'd never seen water so completely still. It looked more like polished glass than an actual lake. I heated a can of soup on my camp stove and ate while watching the tree line. A few birds called from the forest, but their voices sounded muted and distant. The usual evening chorus of insects never started. Even for a quiet park, this level of silence felt unnatural. Darkness fell quickly once the sun disappeared behind the western peaks. I kept my camp stove burning low for light, not wanting to use my flashlight unless necessary. Anyone planning to steal camping gear would be more cautious around obvious artificial light sources. The first whistle cut through the silence at exactly 9:43. I checked my watch the moment I heard it, some automatic response trained into me by years of filing incident reports. The sound came from across the lake, a long melodic note that lasted maybe 5 seconds. It wasn't any bird call I recognized, and I'd spent enough time in wilderness areas to know most of the common species. The whistle repeated 3 minutes later, Closer this time. Same duration, same pitch, but definitely from a different location. Whatever was making the sound had moved along the shoreline. I sat completely still, listening. My camping experience had taught me that staying quiet and observant was usually the best response to unfamiliar wildlife behavior. Most animals would lose interest and move on if you didn't present a threat. The third whistle came from directly across the lake from my position. The sound carried clearly over the water, echoing slightly off the surrounding cliffs. Still the same melodic tone, but something about it seemed purposeful, deliberate. Without really thinking about it, I pursed my lips and whistled back. Same pitch, same duration, just mimicking what I'd heard. The response was immediate silence, complete, absolute quiet that lasted for nearly 10 minutes. I started to think whatever had been making the sound had left. Then I heard it again, much closer, maybe 30 yards from my campsite, hidden somewhere in the dense pine trees. The whistle sounded different now, shorter, more urgent, almost questioning. I whistled back again, keeping the same tone but making it briefer. A simple response, nothing aggressive or challenging. This time, the answering whistle came from behind me. I turned around carefully, scanning the darkness beyond my small circle of camp stove light. The forest looked impenetrable, just black shapes and deeper shadows. Over the next hour, the pattern continued. The creature, because I was certain now it was some kind of animal, would whistle from different positions around my campsite. Each time I responded with a similar whistle. Each time it moved to a new location. I couldn't see it, couldn't hear it moving through the underbrush. Only the whistles revealed its presence, and they came from places that seemed impossible for any large animal to reach quickly. One moment it sounded like it was up in the trees to my left. The next, it was calling from ground level on my right. Around midnight, I realized it was circling me, methodically, patiently, maintaining a consistent distance of maybe 20 to 30 yards. I sat by my camp stove, responding to each whistle while trying to understand what I was dealing with. The creature never came closer, never made any threatening sounds or movements that I could detect. It just watched and whistled and waited for my responses. I didn't sleep. Every time I considered crawling into my tent, the whistling would start up again, reminding me that something was out there, something that had been studying me for hours. The eastern sky started showing the first gray hints of dawn around 5:30. The whistling stopped abruptly, cutting off mid-note during what would have been another exchange. I waited 20 minutes, listening for any sign that the creature was still nearby. Nothing. The forest had returned to its unnatural silence. I packed my gear with shaking hands, moving as quickly as possible while trying not to make excessive noise. The rational part of my brain insisted I'd encountered some unfamiliar but harmless wildlife. Maybe a species I hadn't learned about during my ranger training. The rest of me wanted to get out of those woods immediately. During the drive back to the ranger station, I kept checking my rearview mirror. The empty road stretched behind me, morning light filtering through the pine branches. No signs of pursuit or observation. Whatever had spent the night circling my campsite had let me leave without incident. At the station, I pulled out an incident report form and stared at the blank lines. How do you explain 8 hours of systematic whistling from an unidentified creature? How do you document being studied by something you never actually saw? I wrote 3 sentences about unusual wildlife activity near Mirror Lake and filed the report in the appropriate folder. My supervisor would glance at it during his weekly review and probably assume I'd heard an owl or some other common nocturnal bird. The truth was, I had no idea what had stalked me through the night. No idea why it had responded to my whistles, or why it had maintained such careful distance. No idea why a creature capable of that level of sophisticated behavior would choose to live in a park that barely attracted any human visitors. All I knew was that something lived in those woods, something that understood patterns and communication, something that had been watching me long before I'd noticed it watching back. And I was starting to understand why Blackwood National Park felt so fundamentally wrong to everyone who visited. We weren't the ones doing the observing here. We were the ones being observed. I spent the next 3 days avoiding Mirror Lake entirely, sticking to routine maintenance tasks that kept me close to the visitor center, replacing trail markers, updating bulletin boards, organizing supply closets, anything that let me stay busy without venturing too far into the wilderness. Sleep came in short bursts, and every small sound outside my cabin made me freeze and listen for that haunting whistle. The incident report I'd filed felt more inadequate each time I thought about it. 3 sentences about unusual wildlife activity didn't begin to capture what had happened out there. Whatever had circled my campsite understood communication patterns in ways that challenged everything I thought I knew about animal behavior. Thursday morning brought the sound of tires on gravel, pulling me out of my thoughts about the Mirror Lake encounter. I looked up from the trail map I'd been updating to see a silver SUV parking in the first visitor space. The sight of actual tourists felt surreal after weeks of emptiness. A family of 3 climbed out of the vehicle. The father stretched his back and surveyed the surrounding peaks, while a young boy immediately ran toward the trailhead signs, reading each one with obvious excitement. The mother stayed closer to their car, checking her phone and looking around with the expression of someone who'd expected more civilization. I walked over to greet them, pulling on my professional demeanor like a familiar jacket. "Welcome to Blackwood National Park. I'm David, one of the park rangers here." "Robert Turner," the father said, extending his hand. "This is my wife, Sarah, and our son, Tyler." Tyler bounced on his toes beside the trail markers. "Dad, look at all these trails. Can we hike to the waterfalls?" Sarah Turner offered a polite but strained smile. "We were hoping to do some family hiking, but honestly, this place feels more remote than I expected." "How far are we from the nearest town?" "About 45 minutes back the way you came," I said, noting the way she kept glancing toward the tree line. "But we have everything you need here at the visitor center, and cell service is actually pretty reliable near the main trails." Robert pulled a folded park brochure from his pocket. "We were thinking about the Pine Ridge Trail. The website said it was good for families." I nodded, though a part of me wanted to suggest they try a different park entirely. Something about Sarah's nervousness reminded me of those phone calls I'd been getting, people who sensed something off about Blackwood before they even arrived. But Tyler was practically vibrating with enthusiasm, and Robert seemed genuinely excited about spending time outdoors with his family. "Pine Ridge is perfect for an 8-year-old, I said. "It's well marked, not too challenging, and the views from the ridge are spectacular. I'd be happy to guide you through the first part if you'd like." Sarah's shoulders relaxed slightly. "That would be great, actually. I'd feel better having someone who knows the area with us." We spent 20 minutes at the visitor center while I gathered basic supplies, and the Turner family studied the displays about local geology and wildlife. Tyler pressed his face against the glass cases, asking rapid-fire questions about everything from pine cones to rock formations. His parents seemed more focused on practical concerns, weather conditions, trail difficulty, emergency procedures. I led them to the Pine Ridge trailhead, deliberately choosing a route that avoided the eastern sections, where I'd noticed fog patterns developing over the past few months. The standard trail loop would take us through dense pine forest, up to a scenic overlook, and back to the parking area in about 3 hours. The first hour went exactly like dozens of guided hikes I'd led before.
Tyler ran ahead to investigate interesting rocks or unusual trees, always staying within sight. Robert asked thoughtful questions about the park's geological history, while Sarah gradually seemed to relax as we moved deeper into the peaceful forest setting. I pointed out features I'd explained countless times to other visitors: how the valley had been carved by glacial activity thousands of years ago, why certain pine species thrived at this elevation, where to look for signs of elk or deer activity along the trail. Tyler's energy never flagged. He collected smooth stones in his pockets, counted different types of pine cones, and made up elaborate stories about the wildlife he imagined living in hollow logs. His enthusiasm was infectious, and even Sarah began asking questions about the wildflowers we passed. We reached the halfway point without incident. The trail curved around a series of granite outcroppings that provided natural rest stops and photo opportunities. Robert took pictures of Tyler posing with his arms spread wide, trying to hug an enormous pine tree. Sarah actually laughed when Tyler announced he was going to bring some of his collected rocks home to show his friends. I checked my watch. 2 hours since we'd started, right on schedule. The return loop would take us through a slightly different section of forest before rejoining the main trail near the visitor center. Easy terrain, familiar territory. Nothing that should present any challenges for a fit family.
That's when I noticed the temperature drop. It happened gradually, so subtle that I almost missed it. The kind of change that comes with weather systems moving through mountain valleys. But the sky remained clear, and there was no wind to account for the sudden chill in the air. Tyler had wandered about 20 yards ahead, investigating a cluster of tall pine trees that marked the beginning of the forest's denser sections. He called back to us excitedly about something he'd found. Probably another interesting rock or an animal track. I was explaining to Robert how snowpack affected the park's water systems when I saw the fog. It rolled in from the eastern valley like a living thing, moving too fast and too deliberately to be natural weather. Thick, gray-white mist that swallowed everything it touched. The wall of fog moved between the pine trees with purpose, flowing around obstacles instead of dispersing the way normal fog should. "Tyler!" I shouted, breaking off my explanation mid-sentence. "Come back here right now!" But Tyler had disappeared behind the cluster of pine trees, probably crouched down examining whatever had caught his attention. The fog reached the tree line and began pouring between the trunks like water filling a container. Robert and Sarah both turned to see what had alarmed me. Sarah's face went pale the moment she saw the approaching mist. "What is that?" she whispered. I was already moving toward Tyler's last position, but the fog moved faster than I could run. Within seconds, the dense mist had swallowed the entire cluster of pine trees. I could hear Tyler's voice somewhere inside, but the sound was muffled and seemed to come from multiple directions at once. "Tyler!" Robert's voice cracked as he called his son's name. "Tyler, come back to us!" Sarah grabbed my arm. "Get him out of there. Please, just get him out." I pulled my radio from my belt and keyed the emergency frequency. "Dispatch. This is Ranger Mitchell at Pine Ridge Trail. I have a missing child situation and need immediate backup." The response came through with heavy static. "Copy that, David. What's your exact location?" "Mile marker 7 on the Pine Ridge Loop. Child is lost in heavy fog. Visibility near 0. I kept my voice professional while my mind raced through options. "ETA on backup?" "Nearest unit is about 3 hours out. Weather service shows no fog in your area." 3 hours. I looked at the wall of mist that had swallowed Tyler Turner, knowing I couldn't wait for help that was hours away. I grabbed the emergency rope from my pack and tied one end around my waist. "Robert, hold this rope. No matter what happens, don't let go. If I give 3 sharp tugs, pull me out immediately." Sarah was crying now, calling Tyler's name over and over. Robert took the rope with shaking hands, but looked completely lost. "Stay right here," I told them. "Don't move from this spot, I'll find him." I stepped into the fog and immediately understood why the temperature had dropped so dramatically. The mist wasn't just thick, it was wrong. Cold in a way that seemed to leach heat directly from my body. Within 2 steps, I couldn't see my own hand stretched out in front of me. "Tyler!" I called. "Can you hear me? Keep talking so I can find you!" My voice came back at me strangely, bouncing off surfaces that shouldn't exist in open forest. The echoes overlapped and distorted, making it impossible to judge distance or direction. I moved forward carefully, testing each step before putting my full weight down. The rope around my waist provided my only connection to the outside world. I could hear Robert and Sarah calling Tyler's name from behind me, but their voices sounded impossibly distant. "Tyler," I called again. "Stay where you are. I'm coming to get you." Nothing. No response, no sound of movement through the underbrush. The fog seemed to absorb sound the same way it blocked light, creating a bubble of isolation that defied explanation. I tried to estimate how far I'd traveled, but the disorientation was complete. Each step felt like walking through water, with resistance that made normal movement exhausting. My breathing became labored, as if the fog itself was consuming oxygen. 10 minutes passed, 15, 20. I called Tyler's name until my throat was raw, moving in what I hoped were systematic search patterns. But without visual landmarks, I had no way to know if I was covering new ground or walking in circles. The rope around my waist had gone slack, meaning I'd traveled its full length without finding any trace of Tyler Turner. I had to make a choice: untie the rope and continue searching, or retreat and hope the fog would clear enough for a proper search and rescue operation. I gave 3 sharp tugs on the rope and felt immediate tension as Robert began pulling me back toward the edge of the fog bank. The return journey felt like swimming upward through thick liquid, each step requiring enormous effort. When I finally emerged from the mist, Robert and Sarah were both crying. I was soaked with condensation and shivering from cold that seemed to go deeper than my skin. "Did you find him?" Sarah asked, though my empty hands already provided the answer. I shook my head, unable to meet her eyes. The fog is too thick. I couldn't see anything. As if responding to my words, the wall of mist began to thin. Within minutes, it was dissipating as mysteriously as it had appeared, rolling back toward the eastern valley like a retreating tide. The temperature returned to normal. The forest looked exactly as it had before, except Tyler Turner was gone. The search began immediately. I radioed for emergency backup, while Robert and Sarah Turner stood at the edge of where the fog had been, calling Tyler's name into air that had returned to normal temperature. Within 20 minutes, we had local law enforcement en route. Within an hour, volunteer search teams from 3 neighboring counties were mobilizing with dogs and specialized equipment. I coordinated the initial grid search while trying to explain what had happened to Deputy Martinez, the first responder who arrived from the county sheriff's department. How do you describe fog that moves with purpose? How do you explain a weather phenomenon that exists in defiance of every meteorological report? The mist came in fast from the eastern valley, I told him, sticking to observable facts. Dense coverage, 0 visibility. The boy was maybe 20 yards ahead when it hit. Martinez nodded and made notes, but I could see the questions in his eyes. The same questions I'd been asking myself since the fog first appeared. Robert Turner threw himself into the search with desperate energy, volunteering for every sweep team and refusing breaks, even when exhaustion made him stumble. He studied topographical maps with single-minded focus, suggesting areas we might have missed, alternate routes Tyler could have taken. Sarah remained at the visitor center, sitting on the same bench where I'd first seen them, staring at the tree line as if willing her son to emerge. The
The tracking dogs arrived 6 hours after Tyler's disappearance. German shepherds and bloodhounds trained for wilderness rescue. Handlers confident they could pick up an 8-year-old's trail within minutes. I watched the lead handler, a woman named Janet with 20 years of experience, try to coax her dog past the cluster of pine trees where Tyler had vanished. The dog wouldn't cross the invisible line where the fog had been thickest. "She's never acted like this before," Janet said, kneeling beside her German shepherd. The animal whined and backed away from the trees, ears flat against her head. "It's like she's afraid of something." 3 different dogs from 3 different handlers produced the same results. They could track Tyler's scent to the exact spot where he'd disappeared, but refused to continue beyond that point. One of the bloodhounds actually vomited after being forced closer to the trees, then spent 10 minutes shaking uncontrollably.
"Must be a chemical spill or something," one handler suggested. "Sometimes industrial contamination can mess with their senses. But I knew there had been no chemical spills in this area. No industrial activity for 50 miles in any direction. The dogs were reacting to something else entirely." We expanded the search grid systematically, moving outward from Tyler's last known position in concentric circles. Teams of volunteers walked arm in arm through sections of forest, calling his name and watching for any sign of disturbance in the underbrush. Helicopter overflights provided aerial photography of the broader area, looking for clothing or movement that ground teams might miss. By midnight, we had over 40 people searching an area covering roughly 6 square miles. Portable lights turned sections of wilderness into temporary work sites. Radio chatter coordinated movements between teams, the organized chaos of a missing child search in full operation. I caught a few hours of sleep around 3 in the morning, leaving the coordination to Deputy Martinez while I recharged enough to function. The search would continue at dawn with fresh volunteers and additional resources from the State Emergency Management Office. Sarah Turner never left her bench. Every time I checked on her, she was sitting in the same position, watching the forest with hollow eyes that seemed to see something the rest of us missed. She declined offers of food or coffee, responding to questions with single-word answers that gradually became no answers at all. The second morning brought more teams, more dogs, and more systematic coverage of terrain we'd already searched twice. I took point on a group heading toward the southeastern ravines, areas where someone Tyler's size might have taken shelter if he'd become lost and disoriented. That's where I found him. The ravine cut deep into the forest floor, maybe 15 feet across and equally deep. Dense vegetation concealed the opening until you were almost on top of it. During normal searches, it would have been easy to miss. But something had disturbed the plant life around the rim, creating a path of broken branches and trampled soil. Tyler Turner lay at the bottom of the ravine, partially hidden beneath a fallen pine bough. I knew he was dead before I rappelled down to check. The way his body was positioned, the complete stillness, the fact that he hadn't responded to our calls during 18 hours of searching. But seeing him up close made my stomach clench in ways that had nothing to do with grief. The boy's torso was covered in deep claw marks, parallel cuts that went through his jacket and shirt to the flesh beneath. The wounds were too precise to be from falling on branches, too systematic to be accidental trauma. They looked deliberately inflicted. Both of Tyler's hands had been severed cleanly at the wrists. I'd seen bear attacks during my time as a ranger. I'd dealt with mountain lion kills and the aftermath of various predator encounters. This was different. The cuts were too clean, too purposeful. Bears didn't remove specific body parts with surgical precision. I radioed my position and requested emergency medical personnel, though it was clearly too late for medical intervention. Within 30 minutes, the ravine became the center of a new kind of activity. Crime scene photographers, the county coroner, state investigators who specialized in wilderness fatalities. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the county coroner, spent an hour examining Tyler's body before approaching me privately. She was a small woman in her 60s with gray hair and no-nonsense efficiency, someone who'd seen enough death to recognize when something didn't fit normal patterns. "I need to ask you about predator activity in this area," she said, keeping her voice low enough that nearby investigators couldn't hear. "We have black bears, occasionally mountain lions. Nothing that's shown aggressive behavior toward humans. These wounds weren't made by typical predators." Dr. Reeves pulled out her tablet and showed me close-up photographs of Tyler's injuries. "Look at the cutting angles on the wrist wounds. Clean separation, minimal tearing. That takes opposable thumbs and considerable strength." My mouth went dry. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying whatever did this has human-like dexterity. The claw marks on his torso could be from an animal, but removing both hands, this precisely requires tool use or anatomical capabilities that don't match any known wildlife in this region." We stood in silence while her words sank in. Around us, investigators continued their methodical documentation of the scene. Photography, evidence collection, measurements. Everything proceeding according to established protocols for wilderness fatalities. "What goes in your official report?" I asked. Dr. Reeves closed her tablet and looked toward the ravine where Tyler's body was being prepared for transport. "Animal attack. Probable bear encounter resulting in fatal injuries. That's what everyone expects to hear." "And the hands?" "Scavenging behavior. Post-mortem removal by smaller animals or birds. It happens." But her expression told me she didn't believe her own explanation any more than I did. Robert and Sarah Turner arrived an hour later to identify their son's body. I watched from a distance as Dr. Reeves explained what they'd found, using careful language that focused on closure rather than specifics. Sarah collapsed against her husband when the sheet was pulled back. Robert's face went completely blank, as if something inside him had simply shut down. They stayed for maybe 10 minutes, long enough for the formal identification, brief enough to avoid questions about details. When they returned to their car, Robert looked directly at me for the first time since Tyler's disappearance. "This isn't over," he said quietly. Then they drove away, leaving me with a crime scene that made no sense and questions I couldn't answer in any official capacity. I spent the rest of the afternoon completing paperwork, incident reports, coordination logs, witness statements. Everything documented according to standard procedures for wilderness emergencies. I wrote about the fog as unusual weather conditions. I described the search efforts in detail. I summarized the discovery of Tyler's body as a tragic outcome to a missing child case. The official story was simple. An 8-year-old boy had wandered away from his family during a guided hike, become lost in heavy fog, and fell victim to an animal attack. Tragic but explainable. The kind of incident that happened occasionally in wilderness areas, reminding people that nature could be dangerous for those who weren't properly prepared. By evening, the search teams had dispersed. The crime scene tape came down. The ravine where Tyler Turner died returned to its normal quiet, with only broken vegetation to mark what had happened there. I drove back to my cabin as sunset turned the sky purple behind the western peaks. The day's events felt unreal, like something I'd witnessed rather than lived through. Tyler's excited voice asking about waterfalls, Sarah's nervousness about the remote location, Robert's enthusiasm for family hiking time. All of it ended in a ravine with injuries that couldn't be explained by any animal I knew existed in these mountains. The whistling started again around midnight. I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the incident report I'd filed electronically an hour earlier, when the familiar melodic sound drifted through my cabin walls. Same pitch, same duration, same deliberately communicative quality I remembered from Mirror Lake. But this time I didn't whistle back. I sat completely still, listening to the creature move around my cabin in slow, patient circles. The sound came from different positions over the course of an hour, always maintaining the same careful distance. Sometimes it seemed to pause outside my windows, waiting for a response that never came. Tyler Turner was dead. His hands had been removed with precision that suggested intelligence and planning. Something in these woods possessed capabilities that defied everything I thought I understood about wilderness predators. The whistling continued until dawn, but I never responded. Not that night, and never again. I was checking the trail maintenance log at Marker 3 when I saw the silver SUV in the parking lot. The same vehicle that had brought the Turner family here 12 days ago, when Tyler was still alive and excited about hiking to waterfalls. My stomach dropped as I recognized the license plate. 6 days had passed since Tyler's funeral, according to the newspaper obituary I'd found online. I'd expected the Turners to stay far away from Blackwood, to associate this place with nothing but grief and loss. Instead, they'd come back. I closed the maintenance log and walked toward the visitor center, trying to prepare myself for whatever conversation was about to happen. Through the trees, I could see 2 figures sitting on the bench near the Pine Ridge trailhead, the same spot where Tyler had bounced on his toes, reading trail signs with obvious excitement. Robert and Sarah Turner sat motionless, separated by maybe 2 feet of bench space that felt like a canyon. Neither of them spoke or acknowledged my approach. Sarah looked like she'd lost 20 pounds in less than 2 weeks, her face hollow and her clothes hanging loose. Dark circles under her eyes suggested sleep had become a stranger. Robert maintained his focus on the tree line, scanning back and forth with the intensity of someone watching for movement. "Mr. and Mrs. Turner," I said carefully. "I didn't expect to see you back here." Robert turned first, meeting my eyes with a directness that made me uncomfortable. "We need to understand what really happened to Tyler." Sarah remained facing the forest, but I caught her slight nod of agreement. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers moving in small, repetitive patterns, like she was counting something invisible. "I'm so sorry for your loss," I said, meaning it completely. Tyler was a special kid. His enthusiasm about everything we saw on the trail, I'll never forget that. "Thank you." Robert's voice carried no emotion, just acknowledgement of words that needed to be said. "But we're not here for condolences. We're here for answers." I settled into my standard explanation, the same one I'd given to investigators and reporters who'd covered the story. As I told the sheriff's department, Tyler wandered ahead when the fog rolled in. The visibility was 0, and by the time it cleared, he'd already fallen into that ravine. The animal attack happened after the fall, probably while he was unconscious. It was quick. Sarah finally looked at me, and her expression stopped my prepared speech cold. Her eyes held a knowledge that went beyond grief, beyond the normal responses to losing a child. "What about the fog?" she asked quietly. "What about it?" "You said it rolled in fast. From which direction?" I hesitated, remembering how the mist had moved between the trees, with purpose that defied meteorology. "From the eastern valley. Weather systems come through there sometimes." But the weather service had no fog warnings that day. I checked. Sarah's voice never rose above a whisper, but each word carried weight. "Clear skies predicted through the evening." My mouth went dry. Of course they'd checked weather reports. Of course they'd investigated every detail surrounding their son's death. "Mountain weather can be unpredictable," I said weakly. "Have other children disappeared here?" Sarah asked. The question hit me like cold water. No. Tyler's death was an isolated incident. Are you sure? I wanted to lie, to give them the comfort of believing their son's death was purely random tragedy. But Sarah's hollow stare demanded honesty in ways I wasn't prepared to handle. I've been here 2 years, I said. No other missing children in that time. What about before that? I wouldn't have access to those records. Robert leaned forward slightly. We'd like permission to search the area where you found Tyler. The ravine has already been thoroughly investigated. The sheriff's department cleared the scene after collecting all evidence. We're not looking for evidence, Robert said. We're looking for understanding. I knew I should refuse. Crime scenes, even cleared ones, weren't tourist attractions. Grieving parents shouldn't spend time at the locations where their children died, but something in Robert's tone suggested he'd search the area with or without my permission. I can escort you there, I said finally, but I need to stay with you the entire time. Sarah stood first, moving with the stiff movements of someone whose body was operating on willpower alone. Robert followed, and we began walking toward the Pine Ridge trailhead. The morning air carried the typical mountain chill, but Sarah seemed unaffected by temperature. She wore only a light sweater over jeans, no jacket or extra layers. Her attention stayed focused upward, scanning the canopy and sky with constant movement. Have you noticed anything unusual about the wildlife patterns here? She asked as we passed the first trail marker. Unusual how? Birds. Migration timing, nesting behavior, feeding patterns, animals avoiding certain areas. The question made my chest tighten. Over the past 18 months, I documented significant changes in animal behavior throughout the park. Decreased bird activity in eastern sections, elk avoiding traditional grazing areas, small mammals abandoning previously established territories, all changes that had no logical explanation based on seasonal patterns or environmental factors. Wildlife populations fluctuate naturally, I said. Weather, food availability, breeding cycles all affect animal behavior. But you have noticed changes. It wasn't a question. Sarah spoke with the certainty of someone who already knew the answer. We walked in silence for the next 10 minutes, following the familiar path toward the cluster of pine trees where Tyler had vanished. My radio remained clipped to my belt, emergency procedures memorized, but I found myself listening for sounds that had nothing to do with standard park safety protocols. Robert broke the quiet as we approached the halfway point. I've been doing research since Tyler died. Satellite imagery, geological surveys, old park records. This place has features that aren't on any official maps. My blood went completely cold. What kind of features? I asked carefully. Large depressions in the eastern sections. Circular formations that show up on aerial photography but aren't documented anywhere in park literature. I found references to strange lights in historical reports from the 1970s. The crater, the massive hole I'd discovered during unauthorized exploration of restricted areas. The crater I'd found months ago but never reported, never mentioned to anyone, never included in any incident documentation. I'm not familiar with any unusual geological features, I said, the lie feeling heavy on my tongue. The satellite images show something significant about 2 miles east of here, through the dense forest. A large circular opening. Robert's voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent sleepless nights researching every detail. Have you ever explored the restricted areas of the park? I'd never told the Turners about the crater, never mentioned it in any official capacity. But Robert's independent investigation had led him to the same discovery I'd made months earlier. The realization that he was actively hunting for answers made my hands shake. The ravine looked smaller in daylight than it had during the search. Without emergency vehicles and dozens of volunteers, without crime scene tape and the organized chaos of an active investigation, it was just another depression in the forest floor. a natural feature that could have existed for thousands of years, carved by water and weather into the landscape. I led Robert and Sarah through the familiar approach, past the broken vegetation that still marked where search teams had trampled through underbrush 2 weeks ago. The path down to the rim remained visible, though new growth was already beginning to reclaim the disturbed soil. Sarah walked faster as we got closer, her movements becoming more urgent with each step. Robert stayed beside her but kept his head up, scanning the tree line with mechanical precision. His eyes moved in steady sweeps, left to right, checking every shadow and cluster of branches, like he expected something to emerge from the forest at any moment. "This is where we found him," I said quietly as we reached the edge. Sarah dropped to her knees immediately. Not carefully, not with the hesitation you'd expect from someone approaching the place where her child died. She fell forward onto her hands and began pushing through the loose soil and pine needles, digging with her bare fingers. "Sarah," Robert said softly, "what are you doing?" She didn't answer. Her hands moved through the dirt with desperate purpose, throwing aside handfuls of soil and decomposing leaves. I watched her fingers work through the earth, searching for something specific. Her sweater rode up as she leaned further forward, and I could see her spine through the thin fabric. She'd lost more weight than I'd initially noticed. "Mrs. Turner," I said carefully, "what are you looking for?" "They have to be here somewhere." Her voice was muffled because she spoke while continuing to dig. He wouldn't leave without them. I looked at Robert, hoping for explanation, but he was still watching the forest. His attention never shifted to his wife's increasingly frantic excavation, like he was standing guard while she searched. Sarah's movements became more aggressive, her fingers scraping against rocks and tree roots. She'd created a shallow depression maybe 2 feet across, disturbing soil that had settled naturally over the weeks since Tyler's body was removed. Dirt clung to her fingernails and stained her sweater. "Mrs. Turner, I think we should head back to the visitor center," I said. "This isn't healthy for you." "Not yet." She finally looked up at me, and her face was streaked with soil. "I need to check one more area." She moved 3 feet to the left and began digging again. Same desperate motion, same systematic searching through earth that held nothing but roots and insects. I watched her destroy another section of forest floor, driven by some internal conviction that made no sense to me. Robert finally spoke without taking his eyes off the tree line. "She's been doing this since we got home from the funeral. Digging in our backyard, checking under bushes, going through Tyler's room looking for something." "Looking for what?" "She won't say. Or maybe she can't." I knelt beside Sarah, trying to get her attention. Her hands were bleeding now from scraping against rocks, small cuts across her knuckles and palms. She either didn't notice or didn't care. "Sarah, you're hurting yourself. Let's get these cleaned up." She finally stopped digging and sat back on her heels. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, like she'd been running instead of sitting in dirt for 10 minutes. "We need to go," she said suddenly. "This isn't the right place." She stood quickly, brushing soil from her jeans with shaking hands. I helped her back to her feet, noticing how light she felt, like she was disappearing from the inside out. We walked back toward the trail in silence. Sarah moved ahead of us, setting a pace that forced Robert and me to follow rather than lead. Her attention stayed focused on the ground, scanning left and right as if she was tracking something invisible. Halfway back to the visitor center, she stopped walking completely. "Have you found them?" she asked without turning around. The question hit me like ice water. Something in her tone suggested she already knew the answer, that she was testing whether I'd tell the truth. "Found what?" I asked. Sarah turned to face me, and her expression made my chest tighten with recognition. the same hollow awareness I'd seen in her eyes at the bench, the same look of someone who understood things she shouldn't be able to understand. "Our hands," she whispered. Robert moved closer to his wife and placed his arm around her shoulders. The gesture was protective, but also restraining, like he was prepared to physically guide her if necessary. "Sarah's been having dreams," Robert explained quietly. "About Tyler. She says he's been calling for help." I stood completely still, afraid that any movement would make this conversation continue in directions I wasn't prepared to handle. "Dreams about what, specifically?" I asked. Sarah's voice became barely audible. "He's standing near a big hole in the ground, crying because he can't climb out. He keeps showing me his arms, where his hands should be, asking me to help him find them." My blood went completely cold. "He says they're somewhere in the park," Sarah continued. "Somewhere dark where people aren't supposed to go. He shows me his wrists and tells me his hands are waiting for him." Robert's grip on his wife's shoulders tightened. The dream started 3 nights after the funeral. Same thing every time. Tyler standing at the edge of some kind of pit, unable to climb out because his hands were taken. Sarah looked directly at me with eyes that seemed to see through everything I was trying to hide. "You know where it is, don't you? The place Tyler keeps showing me." I wanted to lie, to stick with official park boundaries and documented features to insist that no such location existed within Blackwood's territory. But Sarah's description was too accurate, too specific to the geographical feature I'd found and never reported. "There are restricted areas in the eastern sections," I said carefully. "Places where the public isn't allowed for safety reasons." "Take us there," Sarah said. "I can't. Those areas are off limits to civilians. Tyler's hands are there." Her voice carried absolute certainty. "I know they are." Robert studied my face with the same intensity he'd been watching the forest. "You've been there before. You know exactly what Sarah's talking about." The weight of their combined attention made it impossible to maintain any pretense. They'd done their research, followed leads that had brought them back to Blackwood with specific information. Sarah's dreams provided details that matched geological features she couldn't have known about through normal channels. "If such a place existed," I said slowly, "visiting it would violate numerous park regulations. I could lose my job." "Tyler's already lost," Sarah said quietly. "We're just trying to bring him home." I looked at both of them, seeing parents who'd crossed the line from grief into something else entirely. People who believed supernatural forces had taken their son and wouldn't accept conventional explanations for his death. They weren't going to leave Blackwood without answers, and they'd continue searching with or without my assistance. The crater was real. Tyler's severed hands were real. The whistling that surrounded my cabin was real. Everything that had happened over the past 2 weeks pointed toward forces operating in these mountains that couldn't be explained through normal wildlife behavior or natural phenomena. Sarah waited for my response with the patience of someone who already knew what I'd decide. Robert continued scanning the forest, prepared for whatever we might encounter in restricted territory. "Tomorrow morning," I said finally. "Dawn. We go once. We document what we find, and then you leave the park for good." Sarah nodded, and for the first time since Tyler's death, something like relief appeared in her expression. "Thank you," she whispered. I met them at the visitor center parking lot while the sky was still more black than gray. The Turners sat in their SUV with the engine running, exhaust visible in the cold morning air. Sarah's silhouette in the passenger seat never moved, but Robert got out immediately when he saw my truck's headlights. "You came," he said. and I heard relief in his voice, like he'd been expecting me to change my mind. I said I would. Robert walked to the back of his vehicle and opened the tailgate. Inside, organized with military precision, was enough climbing equipment to outfit a small expedition. Ropes, harnesses, carabiners, headlamps, and what looked like professional rappelling gear. Everything clean and properly maintained, not the kind of borrowed or rented equipment most people would bring to a national park. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked. "Since the funeral." Robert checked each piece of gear systematically, testing clips and examining rope for wear. "I ordered everything online and had it shipped overnight. Sarah's been researching cave rescue techniques." Sarah finally emerged from the passenger side, moving with the same hollow determination I'd seen at the ravine. She wore hiking boots, thick jeans, and a heavy jacket that still looked too big for her shrinking frame. A headlamp was already positioned on her forehead, though she hadn't turned it on yet. "You've never used climbing equipment before," I said. It wasn't a question. YouTube has tutorials for everything. Robert shouldered a large backpack and handed a smaller one to Sarah. We watched probably 30 hours of instructional videos. Knot tying, anchor points, safety procedures. Sarah can tie a figure 8 follow-through in under 10 seconds. I stared at these suburban parents who'd transformed themselves into amateur cave explorers in the 2 weeks since their son's death. People driven by grief beyond rational decision-making, convinced that descending into an unmapped crater would somehow bring closure to a tragedy that defied explanation. "The area we're going to isn't marked on any trail maps," I said. "Getting there requires crossing through restricted territory. If Park Service supervisors find out I took civilians into unauthorized areas, I'll be fired immediately." "No one's going to find out," Robert said. "We're not here to cause problems for you. We just need to see what Sarah's been dreaming about." I looked at Sarah, who was adjusting the straps on her backpack with mechanical precision. Her movements were efficient, but empty, like she was operating on muscle memory while her mind focused elsewhere. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I asked her directly. She met my eyes for the first time that morning. "Tyler's down there. Not his body, but part of him. The part that was taken." I wanted to explain that grief could create powerful illusions, that dreams often reflected psychological trauma rather than supernatural communication. But Sarah's expression carried the same unshakable certainty I'd seen when she described the crater's location with impossible accuracy. We left the visitor center before sunrise, following maintenance roads that turned into game trails as we moved deeper into the eastern sections. I led them through forests that grew progressively denser, past boundaries marked with signs that most tourists never saw. The trees closed overhead, filtering dawn light into scattered patterns that never quite reached the ground. Our boots crunched through pine needles and fallen branches as we walked single file. Robert stayed directly behind me, while Sarah brought up the rear. None of us spoke for the first hour, saving energy for what we knew would be a difficult day. The terrain became more challenging as we approached the crater's location. Steep inclines forced us to grab tree trunks for balance, and loose rocks made every step require careful placement. Sarah never complained or asked for rest breaks, maintaining the same mechanical pace that had carried her through the past 2 weeks. I started recognizing landmarks from my unauthorized exploration months earlier. A distinctive lightning-split pine, rock formations that looked like primitive sculptures, the gradual thinning of vegetation that indicated we were approaching something that didn't belong in this ecosystem. The temperature dropped noticeably as we got closer. Not the gradual coolness of elevation change, but the same sudden chill I'd experienced when Tyler disappeared in the fog. Robert zipped his jacket higher and pulled on gloves. Sarah seemed unaffected, walking through the cold air like it was another irrelevant detail in a world that had stopped making sense. We reached the crater's edge 90 minutes after leaving the visitor center. The massive depression stretched before us, exactly as I remembered it. But seeing it with other people made the scale more devastating. Nearly a mile across, with walls that dropped into darkness so complete that our vision simply stopped at a certain depth. The rim was perfectly circular, too geometrically precise to be a natural formation. Robert whistled softly through his teeth. Jesus Christ. Sarah walked directly to the edge and knelt, looking down into the abyss with complete focus. She pulled the headlamp from her forehead and clicked it on, directing the beam downward. The light disappeared into black void without illuminating anything useful. "Tyler," she called into the crater. Her voice carried down the walls and came back as distorted echoes that seemed to multiply rather than fade. The sound bounced between rock surfaces that shouldn't exist at those depths, creating overlapping responses that made it impossible to judge the crater's actual size. "Tyler, we're here," Sarah called again, louder. This time, the echoes took longer to return, suggesting the crater extended much deeper than visual evidence indicated. The returning voices sounded different too, carrying qualities that didn't match Sarah's original words, like something down there was trying to respond. Robert began unpacking climbing gear with practiced efficiency. "We need to set anchor points here, here, and here," he said, pointing to locations around the rim. "Three-point system for redundancy. If one fails, the other two hold." "You don't know what's down there," I said. "That's why we're going to find out." I watched Robert hammer pitons into solid rock, testing each anchor point with his full body weight before trusting it with rope. His movements showed the confidence of someone who'd studied these procedures, until they became automatic. Sarah continued calling Tyler's name into the crater. Each time, the returning echoes carried more distortion, more suggestion that something was answering back. After the fifth attempt, she went completely still. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Robert and I stopped working and listened. At first, only our own breathing and the small sounds of settling rocks. Then, faintly, something that might have been a child's voice calling from depths that shouldn't be able to sustain human life. "Mommy." The word drifted up from the crater with heartbreaking clarity. Sarah's face transformed with an expression of desperate joy that was painful to witness. "Tyler," she shouted. "We're coming." The response was immediate and unmistakable, a young boy's voice, muffled by distance but clearly calling for help. "Mommy, I can't climb out." Sarah turned to Robert with wild eyes. "He's alive. Tyler's alive down there." Robert finished securing the rope system and began putting on his climbing harness. "We're going down. Both of us." I grabbed his arm before he could attach to the rope. "Stop. Think about what you're hearing. Tyler's been dead for 2 weeks. You saw his body at the morgue." "Something's down there," Robert said. "Whether it's Tyler or something else, Sarah's not going to leave until we find out." Sarah was already putting on her own harness, with movements that showed she'd practiced these motions extensively. Her hands moved through the safety checks with mechanical precision, testing clips and adjusting straps like she'd been climbing for years instead of weeks. "I'm going first," she announced. "No." Robert's voice carried absolute authority. "I go first, make sure it's safe, then call up if you should follow." They looked at each other with the silent communication of a married couple who'd made this decision together. Two parents united in their need to follow their son's voice into a hole that defied geological explanation. I knew I should stop them. Radio for backup, insist we return to the visitor center, contact law enforcement about unstable grieving parents making dangerous decisions. Instead, I helped Robert check his harness one final time and watched him hook into the rope system. "Give me 20 minutes, he told Sarah. "If you don't hear from me, don't come down. Go back to the truck and drive away." Sarah nodded, but I could see in her expression that she would follow him no matter what happened. Robert began his descent into the crater, disappearing below the rim as his headlamp became a small point of light moving down the rock face. The rope system held perfectly, allowing him to control his descent with steady progress. Sarah and I watched the light get smaller and smaller until it became difficult to distinguish from the surrounding darkness. The crater seemed to swallow Robert's presence entirely, leaving us alone at the rim with only the sound of rope sliding through metal clips. "Mommy?" The child's voice called again from below, closer to Robert's position now. "Tyler," Sarah shouted back. "Daddy's coming to get you." 10 minutes passed, then 15. The only sound was wind moving through trees behind us and the occasional scrape of rope against rock as Robert continued his descent. Then, sudden and sharp, Robert's voice came up from the depths. "Oh my God. Oh my God, what is this?" His words carried panic that made my chest tighten with dread. Not surprise or confusion, but genuine terror from someone who'd found something that challenged his understanding of reality. "Robert," Sarah called. "What did you find?" A long pause. Then Robert's voice again, higher pitched and shaking. "Sarah, don't come down here. Do not come down here." Sarah immediately grabbed the second rope and began attaching her harness. "I'm coming." "No, Sarah, listen to me. Whatever you think you're going to find, this isn't it. This isn't Tyler." But Sarah was already over the rim, rappelling down the rope with determination that overrode her husband's warnings. I watched her headlamp follow the same path Robert had taken, becoming another small point of light, descending into impossible depths. I waited at the rim for 5 minutes before making the decision that would change everything. Taking the third rope, I rigged my own descent system and followed the turners into the crater. The walls were smooth basalt, carved with precision that suggested artificial construction rather than natural geological processes. My headlamp revealed tool marks in the rock, geometric patterns that had been deliberately created. The crater wasn't a natural formation, it was excavated. 20 feet down, the walls opened into a much larger space. My light beam swept across a cavern that extended far beyond what should be possible given the surface dimensions. The air carried a smell I couldn't identify, organic but wrong, like decomposition mixed with something metallic. I found Robert and Sarah 30 feet below the surface, standing in what appeared to be a vast underground chamber. They weren't moving or speaking, just staring at something my descending light hadn't illuminated yet. When my feet touched the cavern floor, I understood their silence. The ground was covered with severed human hands, hundreds of them, arranged in concentric circles around carved symbols that hurt to look at directly. The hands were in various states of preservation, some fresh enough to show individual fingerprints, others reduced to bone and dried skin. They'd been placed with ritualistic precision, each positioned according to some pattern that suggested purpose beyond random disposal. In the center of the largest circle, perfectly preserved as if they'd been severed yesterday, were 2 small hands that belonged to an 8-year-old boy. Robert knelt beside Tyler's hands with shaking movements. "They're still warm," he whispered. I took out my phone and began photographing everything. The circular arrangements, the carved symbols, the impossible number of severed appendages that represented years or decades of collection. Each image documented evidence of something that shouldn't exist in any national park, in any natural environment. Sarah reached toward Tyler's hands, but stopped just short of touching them. "Baby," she said softly. Mommy's here." The hands moved. Not randomly, not from air currents or settling. Tyler's severed hands lifted slightly from the cavern floor and turned palm up, like a child reaching to be picked up by his mother. Robert stumbled backward, his light beam swinging wildly across the walls. "We need to leave. Right now." That's when the whistling started. Not from one direction, but from multiple sources around the cavern. The same melodic sound I'd heard at Mirror Lake and outside my cabin, but amplified by dozens of voices. The creature I'd been dealing with wasn't alone. It was part of something much larger. The whistling came from the walls, from passages that led deeper into the mountain, from directions that suggested this cavern system extended far beyond what we could see. We were surrounded by things that had been watching, waiting, collecting. Sarah carefully lifted Tyler's hands, cradling them against her chest like she was holding her sleeping child. "We can go now," she said quietly. Robert gathered the rope and we began our ascent out of the crater. The whistling followed us up the walls, echoing from multiple sources that seemed to track our progress. As we climbed, I realized the truth about Blackwood National Park. It wasn't home to one creature. It was a feeding ground, a place where things lived that required human parts for purposes I didn't want to understand. The missing visitors, the empty trails, the unnatural silence, everything made sense now. We reached the surface as the sun crested the mountains, flooding the forest with light that felt like salvation after the darkness below. Sarah still held Tyler's hands, wrapped carefully in a spare jacket from Robert's pack. The Turners gathered their equipment with mechanical efficiency, packing everything with the same precision they'd shown during preparation. Neither spoke about what we'd found, what we'd photographed, what we'd brought back to the surface. Robert shouldered his pack and looked at me one final time. "Thank you." "Will you report this?" I asked. "Report what? That we went hiking and found some animal remains? That Sarah had closure about Tyler's death?" Robert's expression showed complete understanding of the situation. "We got what we came for. This is over." They walked back toward the visitor center without looking back. I watched them disappear through the trees, carrying Tyler's hands home to whatever burial or ceremony would finally allow them to grieve properly. I stood alone at the crater's rim, staring down into darkness that held secrets I could never share with supervisors, investigators, or anyone else who might want explanations for what existed in these mountains. The whistling had stopped, but I knew it would return. Just like I knew my job had never been about protecting tourists from the park's dangers. My real responsibility was protecting the park's secrets from the outside world, making sure nobody else ever found what the Turners had found. I began the hike back to the visitor center, leaving the crater behind. Tomorrow I'd file another routine maintenance report. I'd update trail conditions and check equipment inventory. I'd continue managing a park that served purposes beyond recreation, purposes that required silence and cooperation from someone who understood what truly lived in these mountains. The Turners were gone by the time I reached the parking lot, their silver SUV nothing but tire tracks in the gravel. They'd found their answers and left Blackwood forever, taking Tyler's remains back to whatever peace they could build from impossible truth. I unlocked the visitor center and sat down at my desk, staring at the blank incident report form. Outside, the mountains stood silent under morning sun, keeping their secrets safe for another day.